Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, desolators, peasants, pestles. I'm a useful idiot. Today I want to talk about NATO. And is NATO still relevant? And now they're asking that question. Of course, the only reason they're asking that question is because they're broke. So that's the only time they ever reevaluate a bureaucracy or a military or anything like that. So anyway, an article came out in the New York Times and it's talking about the shrinking European military spending. And it says that alarmed by years of cuts to military spending, the NATO Secretary General issued a dire public warning to European nations, noting that together they had slashed $45 billion, or the equivalent of Germany's entire military budget, endangering the alliance's viability, its mission, and its relationship with the United States. And that was 2 years ago. And since then, the Afghan war is winding down. There's pressure from the European Union to limit budgets, and Europe only has to cut deeper. In fact, from 2000 to 2013, European military manpower dropped by nearly 1 million soldiers, from 2.5 million to 1.8 million presently. And one of the big problems with this is the United States traditionally paid about 50% of the cost of NATO. They've been paying about 63%, and now the United States is paying 75 to 80% of NATO. And granted, the fact is that NATO is generally used as a puppet operation for United States maneuvers around the globe, but still, the fact is the United States is shouldering nearly the entire financial burden of this operation. And in fact, it says the United States finances nearly 3/4 of NATO's military spending, up from 63% in 2001. And yet, among the alliance's 28 nations, experts note only the United States, Britain, and Greece are meeting NATO's own spending guidelines of 2% of GDP. And Britain and France, of course, will be cutting back considerably. The United States is well above that. The United States spends about 5% of its GDP on military. But so we keep encountering the same fact. How interesting is it that Greece, as broke as Greece is, going in through a severe depression, still spending 2% of its GDP on a military for what? And Britain is broke now too, as well as the United States, and can hardly afford these sort of things. Interestingly enough, one of the biggest contributors to NATO's manpower is Turkey. They can supply up to 500,000 troops to any NATO operation. And that's nearly a third of all European ground manpower. So anyway, and as it turns out, I did a video a couple weeks ago about the fact that military spending in general is down. And it is down because the United States and European nations were the biggest spenders and the biggest producers, and they are down. And therefore it takes global arms spending down. And of course there's a surge in record spending going on in Asia, but it's still not enough to counter the fact that when the Europeans and the United States stop buying, things really slow down. So I wanted to bring that up because I had a commenter challenge me on that video about the fact that spending couldn't be down because Asia was spending like crazy. Well, in fact, in 2012 was the first time military spending among Asian nations exceeded that of the Europeans. So the French military expert was pretty harsh. He said, quote, "We are moving toward a Europe that is a combination of the unable and the unwilling." So they're really trying to motivate these countries to continue spending more on NATO, even though they have a lot more problems to deal with right now. And even when the Europeans are involved in military operations, the United States has to supply most everything else. It says in this article, even as Britain and France have boasted of operations in Libya and Mali, those interventions have revealed Europe's weakness more than its strength. In Libya, the United States supplied intelligence, drones, fighter, and refueling aircraft, ammunition stocks, and missiles to destroy air defenses. And in Mali, the French required American intelligence drones and refueling and transport aircraft. So we end up involved in any case, and then the Europeans supply a small amount of troops. And one reason is because the European Union had a 1999 goal of 60,000 troops available for battle in a Euro Corps. But that idea was abandoned. It's now replaced by battle groups of 1,500 to 2,500 troops that just rotate between European countries. And they are also hesitant to use them. Germany certainly doesn't want to get involved in any overseas operations right now. And a lot of times they also overpromise. They were going to send 550 military trainers to Mali, and they've only sent a handful so far, and they've just arrived. And supposedly that war is going to be over soon, that NATO war. And but one of the hazards, of course, is if Europeans start falling behind, then procurement means a steady decline as older weapons systems become obsolete. And that's just how it is in our modern age, and military technology advancing so quick. So anyway, the combined spending on NATO is 70% of the world's military spending. And that's the reason why when NATO stops buying and Europeans stop buying and Americans slow down, then we have a huge dip in military spending worldwide. But it's still a pretty huge number, I assure you. So anyway, NATO was created in April of 1949, and it was a union of European nations that were based on basic idea was to keep the Americans in Europe, keep the Soviets out of Europe, and keep Germany down. And that's what they did. And then the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact, the equivalent of NATO in Eastern Europe. And they had a legitimate reason for creating this alliance to create a buffer zone between them and Soviet Union and Europe at the time, because the Soviet Union and Russia had been invaded repeatedly over and over and had suffered horribly in the wars inflicted on them over the years. So nobody can really blame them. But that said, NATO now has 28 member states and has 22 what they call Partnership for Peace members. And they occasionally come up with other forms too. Like in 1994, they came up with what was called the Mediterranean Dialogue, so that NATO could coordinate with Israel. And interestingly enough, Iceland is a member of NATO, but they do not have a military. So there's another thing I like about Iceland. They throw bankers in jail, and they don't have a military. And the track record of NATO, and this is when we get back to the discussion, how relevant is NATO? Most would agree that the Soviet Union, and this is Russia now, is certainly not a threat to Europe. And all the Europeans realize it. It's only the United States that still demonizes Russia as a threat. In Europe, they just know that this isn't going to happen. And in fact, Russia considers itself part of this European community. But we look at all the involvement. In fact, in 1954, the Soviet Union suggested that it join NATO to help keep the peace in Europe. But of course, they were rebuffed. But anyway, let's look at the track record of NATO so far. Their actual first engagement was in Bosnia between 92 and 95. That didn't really go too well. They had 60,000 NATO troops there, along with some non-NATO UN troops. And then they were in Yugoslavia and Kosova in 1999. And then we had the Libya operation, and then the ongoing operations in Afghanistan. So NATO hasn't exactly done much, considering all the money and time spent on it over all these many years, 1949. So we're talking about 60 some odd years, 65 years, and not much to show for it. And in 1957, they held huge military operations in Europe. continental Europe, across continental Europe, which was very provocative to the Soviet Union at the time. 250,000 men, 300 ships, and 1,500 aircraft. And then in 1979, through NATO, U.S. nuclear weapons were transferred to Europe, put under the NATO umbrella under Reagan. So, and then the first time the NATO Article 5 was invoked, in which it was agreed that one nation was attacked, all nations would consider themselves to be under attack. And the first time NATO invoked that was the September 11, 2001 attacks. And that's what's helped legitimize the so-called coalitions going into Afghanistan. And it's kind of interesting because Gorbachev allowed German reunification with one promise from America that they wouldn't spread NATO east and any further than Germany. And so as it turns out, here it is this many years later, and now the entire Warsaw Pact, every single country in Eastern Europe practically is a member of NATO, and now open invitations have been given to Macedonia, Georgia, and Ukraine. So now the very ex-states of the Soviet Union are going to be members of NATO at some point and continue the encirclement of Russia, much the way there's an encirclement of China going on. So that's kind of an interesting development, something that NATO represents. Instead of a defense of Europe in case of a Soviet invasion, NATO is now providing the apparatus to encircle Russia fairly aggressively. Interestingly, most countries don't spend 2% of their GDP on military. They're all required to as a member of NATO, but most of them are paying less than that now. So, and that trend will have to continue because these European nations are broke. The willingness to be involved in these interventions, and most importantly, NATO seems to be functioning as a counterpoint with the United States and African neocolonialism. And but then NATO, once again, it seems somewhat irrelevant, depending on what its intentions really are. When the United States policies now militarily are certainly going to be pivoting to the east and further encirclement of China. And so that's the main strategy. So that brings up another reason why NATO is increasingly becoming irrelevant. But as part of the European military-industrial complex, of course, it won't go away no matter how irrelevant it becomes, because just as the military-industrial complex in the United States has to maintain certain U.S. foreign policies, we have to have the military-industrial complex in Europe as well, and the big players like France and Germany. So there's a little bit about NATO. Making a few headlines right now. The United States basically pays for it, and the Europeans probably are not going to be that interested in that many foreign interventions. And the United States is moving its attention towards Asia. So it brings up the question, is NATO still relevant? I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.